This is it. This is bleeding edge podcasting right here. Two old stalwarts.
Dearly gathered.
Two old stalwarts of the industry. Here I am, surrounded by various Nintendo-themed plushies, games lining the walls behind me like a true retro podcaster, and you're there with some weird modern art.
Pants. It's not. Anyway, Phil. How's it? Phil,
All
how's it going?
Yeah, good.
Let's. So today we're going to talk about retro. Right?
Don't we talk about that every time?
What it means to us.
It's a bit of a lame excuse for a podcast, isn't it? What should we talk about? Retro. We did that every other week. Let's do it again.
And what does it really mean to us? And
I don't know. Well, that's why I think we're very different and went off in different directions as far as coming to the end of what we normally talk about. A lot of what we've been talking about is Spectrum, and we both established that we were there from the beginning of the Spectrum days, or even Commodore. I had the VIC-20. Yeah, we both remember loading games from blooming tape. And the joy of moving on to actually plugging games in, cartridges and what have you. Yeah.
So I remember all those things, and then I've gone on from Spectrum, Megadrive, PlayStation, Commodore Amiga, PC, Xboxes, all the latest consoles. So I've continuously kind of played, but I've not. In my adult life, not had the time to really be what people label as a gamer, I guess, anymore. But it was that heyday in when people now call like retro. Maybe we'll come on to what we think is retro. But if we talk about Spectrum, and the reason we talk about our Spectrum days, which when we started the podcast, didn't really just mean ZX Spectrum. It meant like the halcyon days or our memories, our days, right? We were so young, carefree nerds, I suppose. At least me.
I was one of the cool kids. I wasn't a nerd.
And I guess that time, for playing video games from about 10 to 22-ish, was when I just had time. Before I started work, that was when we had time and no pressures in life. It's funny, you think you have pressures. I mean, my son's 16, so he's sort of going through the exams kind of thing. And but that kind of, and those are pressures, I suppose, when you just look back now and you think it was nothing compared to adult life or whatever. But at least, let's say even before that, 10 to 15, 10 to 16, those years, they were just, we just had spare time, right? Yeah. You'd be out playing football down the street and Spectrum when it was raining, or too late, or when you didn't want to go outside, and you could just play a game, and those are retro. But then I guess there's the indie kind of gaming, the whole aspect of making games look like retro games now. The whole 8-bit aesthetic, the pixelated aesthetic. So there's that bit to it. And then there's like the retro, like people really being collectors and getting into those old games. So I've got my memories of the 80s, 90s. For me, that's kind of like my thinking of retro. But you, for example, are more of a collector, right? I mean, so what do you think?
Well, it's interesting. You sort of, I mean, you've split retro it up into its relevant parts, I suppose, really. I mean, there is retro just in thought. What we've been talking, as you say, remembering days, but those are retro times. I suppose retro as a word just means anything that's from the past, I suppose, in a very sort of basic terms.
Well, from its word being in retrospective, right? Retrospective thinking.
So, thinking back to a time. And I mean, as you say, our name, Spectrum Days, just that halcyon period of, as you say, having time to play games. I mean, it's interesting hearing you say that, because in a lot of our reviews, particularly of the Spectrum games, you've often gone, oh my God, did we really play this? If it was particularly there's some more difficult, obscure Spectrum games, which seems to be about 90% of them. But it's interesting, you've sort of contradicted yourself by confirming, it is just that we had the blooming time to put into playing that terribly difficult Spectrum limited game,
Yeah, but then when we play them today, they just seem to be games that you wouldn't spend hours playing. At least the ones that we looked at so far, the kind of more arcade action games. We haven't covered any of the adventure games.
No, I must admit we haven't really. Not even the sort of isometric-y, I don't know, Batman or Head Over Heels, or even those sort of more advanced platformy style games.
And then the other games like Valhalla, Lords of Midnight, those kind of the text-based adventures,
which did go on for hours and hours. Games. I mean, they were big. Yeah.
So, like today, looking at it, I think, how could I have spent hours playing a Spectrum game? For sure, as we moved on to like the Amiga, then yes, there were more in-depth games. Then the PlayStation, for example, there would be more in-depth games, and of course the PC. So getting into my late teens, I could imagine, you could play a long gaming session, or even if it was like with friends, even when it's like things like Mario Kart or the football games. But the Spectrum ones, the ones we play now, you think, wow, why would we? Why would we agree? And I think there was this, and I think we've touched on it quite a few times. It was, we'd never ever seen anything like that before. I mean, when we played Saboteur, it was like, now you kind of think, oh wow, all these ideas that came from Saboteur into these new games, or Turbo. Is it Turbo Spree Challenge, or I can't remember what the games by Durrell as well, with where you're driving a car through the streets. I know I just read recently, an early kind of idea of how, almost like how Grand Theft Auto turned out, right? You're driving through the streets. You think, without these games, without these stepping stones, these great, huge games that exist now, they needed these games to come first, right? The people creating these concepts and ideas and things. But so we'd never seen anything like it. But then there's this other concept of like, were the Spectrum games so almost empty canvases that they would just give us a guide and then our imagination would fill in the rest?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. As you were saying that, I was thinking, well, yeah, of course, that question of retro, it's probably an easier question to answer for somebody probably like your son, or anyone who's, I don't know, between that age, teenage age, and probably early later 20s, which is probably still the sort of majority age group that play games, I'm guessing, and probably still men. I know a lot more women, girls play games now, but I'm guessing it's still that sort of teenage to 20-something men are probably the predominant players of games. I suspect if you asked them what's retro, certainly with regards to gaming, obviously retro could be referred to anything, could be He-Man figures or whatever it is. It's probably going to be easier for them to narrow it down. Because as you just said, we were there when these things were developing. We were there when the ZX Spectrum was the thing, was the current, was the new thing. It was the Xbox Series X1, XX1, whatever the hell the new one's called now. It was the latest thing. So I think it's harder for us to really pin down what retro means. I mean, you said earlier on, almost like off the cuff, about me being a collector. Is that retro? What I'm collecting retro, or does me being a collector come under that? Is that retro anyway? Just because I'm collecting stuff from the past, retro could sort of mean anything, couldn't it? And
Well, we have jokingly said that it's antique collecting, right? I can't remember. I think you said that antiques. How old does something have to be be an antique?
It wasn't it? Oh, it used to be. It was sort of 100 years old.
Oh, okay.
I think.
Well,
I think
there's still a few years to go.
Back in the 80s, when we used to sit there and watch Antiques Roadshow, I'm sure. I'm fairly sure that was what they said.
Well, but it's an interesting thing. I've been kind of thinking about this as well. The history of video games, right? So people are collecting these things, and it's good that you've got your collection of Nintendo, and you've got. But I think it's good to have the Spectrum collection, and there's obviously a lot of people working in the whole retro Spectrum scene, and they are documenting and there's the emulators online. I think that's all important work because I think there's quite a lot of history has been written about video games where the Spectrum's completely written out because it's written from a US centric point of view. In fact, I think for us, we probably don't understand because Spectrum was such a big thing in the UK that for us it was a huge thing, but it just didn't make a mark at all in the US. No. And if we weren't careful, then it will be wiped from history in a way because the US centric
the view of it,
there's just more documentation, right? Yeah. The view of it.
I mean, the flip side to that is that, of course, that we ended up not having a video games crash, which is what happened in America. Because what we then, of course, was the bedroom coders, which that word really only applied or came from the large amount of people over here that could afford to buy what was a ridiculously cheap item, the Spectrum. That was Sinclair's raison d'etre, was to create an affordable machine. And think how compact it was. You think, I know it's not the easiest thing to type on or code on, but it was tiny. You look at it now; it's like a small laptop. It's an incredible thing, which meant that kids could have them in the bedroom. They could sit under it, could go underneath the television or wherever it needed to go. There was no you didn't not sort of need a desk for it, or it wasn't like the BBC. It was a great big hulking thing. It was about 10 times the size of the 48. I think there was such a huge difference, and we ended up with a computer industry over here of games making, like the people who make GTA. So one of the biggest companies and one of the biggest games ever. Is it GTA 5 is sort of still going, isn't it? They've only just recently hinted that the new one's coming out. And their GTA 5's been going for 6 years or something ridiculous.
Yeah, I think there were some leaks. And there will be a new version. But I mean, it was so influential in the UK. But like I say, I think in the US centric books written about the history of video games, it hardly makes an appearance, right? And it's interesting. One of my first jobs, I was working in the telecoms industry, and we had there was a platform called MoFun, which was one of the first where you could download and execute games on a series of Sony Ericsson devices. At the time, there was iMode from Japan, I think. And I'm thinking there was another platform I can't remember the name of. But anyway, that's a kind of like MoFun. That's kind of a period of games for a couple of years. There was games released for those devices, and that's kind of disappeared because there's no. Yeah. So there's none of those.
I did an advert for them. I was in an advert. Yeah, I was in an advert because that was when I was involved in the circus world, and they had a series of people doing things that were in silhouette. Gosh, that sounds rude. Doing things in silhouette that were part of the advertising that were downloaded to the phone as like a sort of phone advert for that. So somewhere there's footage of me juggling 5 rings as part of the advertising for that in Silhouette. How bizarre. Sorry, carry on. That's a strange game. We were both working for the same people. That's a bit weird.
Well, that so what I was trying to get at was kind of because that was for a platform, a mobile platform, which, mobile phones came and went. Those kind of games have kind of disappeared, right? But it's a bit like saying, what happens to a book? Because it's a bit of history that just sort of disappears. And you can say, well, they were only games or whatever. But what did they mean for the culture at the time? Maybe MoFun was a bit different, but like Spectrum was such an important time, and I wonder what will people just read about it in another 40 years' time? What happens to all this history, and what happens, and how important that was to us, and I think it's also important because will it ever happen again? Because those games, like you say, they were accessible. People could code one game themselves, right? You would have games which were the artist, the coder, and even sometimes the music might even just be the same guy, same person. Whole creative kind of almost creative freedom within the constraints, but they had to be inventive within those constraints, right? But also that feeling of there was such, like I said before, there was such an empty canvas that how much was our imagination being played? How much were we using our imagination then in combination with the game? Whilst now, as you get closer and closer to realism or whatever, your imagination doesn't kick in.
Yeah.
Right? You're not using so. Funny enough, our game's less immersive now.
Wow, that's interesting. I mean, you only got to look at the box art, haven't you? Of I say like Atari 2600 games. I mean, good lord, you'd have a thing with a fantastic dragon flying across the sky and a castle underneath, and a damsel screaming out of the window, and a guy on horseback coming to rescue her. And when you plugged in the game, it was a blob going along a line with a slightly larger blob that might be green. That was the dragon. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
But I can't. I've obviously been influenced. We've been thinking and talking about these things, and I think we've touched on them as well. Like, what were we thinking when we were playing this? And it was, like I said, it was the first time we'd ever seen it. We were using our imagination, and if you programmed a little, some of the things seemed achievable. Whilst now you play a AAA game and it was a team of 400 people and millions and millions budget, and it's like that is not achievable for one person. But when we were 10, 12 or whatever, you would get a magazine, you could code some things in, and you could see, okay, I can see how this is done, right? You could if you're into it. But I've been reading online. I found this article called "Filling in the Gaps: Creative Imagination and Nostalgia in ZX Spectrum Gaming" by Will Brooker at Kingston University, UK. This was back in November 2021. So that idea of like filling in the gaps, I'm not. I think I've been thinking in those ways over these episodes, but Will Brooker here has clearly like identified and done that as a proper academic study, interviewing Spectrum owners and going through that, and it seems to be a theme that comes up again and again, of us just being back in those days, confronted with these small sprites, empty screens, and then just using our imagination to fill the rest in. And it's almost like if you're reading, there's reading and there's reading, right? So if you're reading Twitter all day and reading people's thoughts and seeing little video clips, that's not as creative. When you read a novel, it's kind of creative because you're creating those images in your mind, whilst the snippets on Twitter is like telling you what you just consume it. You don't use your imagination. It's like, and I wonder if like the gaming now they're thrill rides. They're like theme park thrill rides, but how much do you play? Does your imagination? I don't know. It's slightly. I guess it's different, but yeah. Even in this article by Will Brooker, he also talks about this idea of paratext.
Paratext.
And paratext. Yeah, paratexts.
From the jungle.
He says here, we can call the supplementary materials that in literature would include the cover and preface, and in this case included not just cover art and promotional boasts, but a map and a scene-setting poem. He was talking about a particular game there. So Avalon, I think, he was talking about. So, so the paratexts, and we've talked about this on the other episodes, right, of buying the game in Menzies. Yeah. I mean, it's funny. In this whole article, he's interviewed people, and they say the same things as us. They
in $1.99.
He talks about he talks about a guy who actually has got his own podcast as well, and had written on his own for retro gaming discussion show. Gordon King, and he's in Scotland, but he's talking about going to Menzies with his dad, and his dad getting bored, saying, "Come on, pick one," and he ends up picking Avalon in this case. So it was we've got these shared memories, this nostalgia. So that's, I guess, the other element of retro is that there's a banding of people wanting to reminisce for that period of time in their lives, and the nostalgia for it. And I'd like to know really more about how nostalgia works. What it triggers in your mind, and because there's clearly a lot of people. Well, not enough people, because not enough people listen to our show, but there's people who are into retro gaming, right? So.
Yeah, it's interesting how it was the zeitgeist, doesn't it? I certainly feel it was easier, perhaps, to get into it then, in that games were $1.99, and they were on every doorstep. Corner shop. I shouldn't say doorstep. They came to your house like the milk. They were every. A copy of Super 10. It was on every shop, every newsagent had a carousel on the desk of $1.99 tapes. It was ubiquitous. It was cheap. It was very Thatcher's Britain. It was a sort of very sort of affordable sort of entertainment for the masses kind of thing, which I'd said from the sort of 90s onwards, it all became 40, 45, 50 quid a game on your console. It wasn't quite the same.
Well, again, until the mobile phone came out, until because like you were saying about the demographic of mostly being, boys or whatever back in the 80s with a Spectrum, maybe, that was the patriarchal system of saying that it wasn't for girls, and that the dads.
Well, my sister would attest to that from at school, that it was rare that you were allowed in the computer room or allowed access to the computer. The school, you'd be lucky if there was one computer per room. Certainly in sort of primary school, when the BBC came out, I mean, there weren't computer rooms. You're lucky if you had one BBC. And I remember, I can hear her saying the boys weren't let to get near it. They all crowd around it. You know what I mean? Girls, I think, were pushed out.
But if you look at it now, the demographics of what is gaming.
Yeah.
So when then Candy Crush and these kind of puzzle games came out then for the mobile phones, well, there was two things. One, that's now created the demographic is completely now it's men, women, different ages as well. It's not games were like hardcore gamers. There was a period with like the PlayStation and the PC. I mean, to get games running on the PC, you kind of needed to know what you were doing. You did need to be a bit nerdy to have the right setup, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then the mobile phone, and you got the democratization, I can never say that word, of the free to play. So people hate free to play. A lot of people complain about free to play within the gaming world, but that does give you free games. Of course, you have to pay for them via in-app purchases, and then you can get into the whole debate of the morals of loot boxes and the mechanics that they've got that people end up spending money, etc. But a Candy Crush game, you could have just kept playing for free, as long as you didn't mind, once you'd lost your 3 lives that day, you'd have to wait X number of hours to be able to come back, or you buy some in-game currency to keep going, right? So talking about accessibility, games suddenly became more accessible. And now you've got Xbox, for example, you pay a monthly subscription and you can get about $15, I think. I don't know how much it is in pounds, but you get all the games you could ever have time to play. If you don't need to have the latest, greatest release on its first day out, you've got plenty of games, I think. So games, there was a period where you needed to be a real hardcore gamer to get into games, and I think it's kind of come out of that now, the other side, and games are just everywhere, and there's just different forms. If that's someone playing Wordle to relax at the end of the day, or if it's a kind of Mahjong or a Candy Crush Match 3 type game, to then having an Xbox at home or a PlayStation and playing, the latest Street Fighter or Call of Duty. I think it's just a lot more. But then you don't get, we were talking just the paratexts, you don't get hardly any of that. You'll see some trailers. We didn't see trailers. We just saw a box, and we bought the game, and we sat in the back of a dad's car. We took the cellophane off, opened the box, read the instructions. Maybe, like it said, there was a map or something in there, and it gives you this extra context around a game, and your imagination's already kicking off. And then you get home, and it's just like this,
a blob,
tiny little sprite on screen, and you had to fill in the gaps.
No, I think they had to, really. I mean, certainly a lot of companies in the end realised that was what was selling games. The more rubbish that you could put in the box, the better. Stickers and, it became a thing to do, didn't it?
I really wish I still had my Shadow of the Beast T-shirt.
I remember that. I remember that being released with it. That was particularly with the Amiga. The Amiga, they did that quite a bit, didn't they? I think they might have done that with Xenon, and I seem to remember something else. Yeah,
it came in a big wide box, I think, and I had a Shadow of the Beast T-shirt. Shadow of the Beast was totally sold on. They had 16 levels of parallax scrolling and amazing flute music.
It was just like a demo, though, wasn't it? You just walked left and right, and that was about it.
It's more basic than our favourite Altered Beast.
It is. Yeah, it is, really. I mean, that was one of those games that got ported over as well, and I think that made it onto the Megadrive and things like that. Just because of how it looked.
But it's funny because I think I still loved it. I mean, I think it was basic. I think it really, really, really was basic, but I just loved the music. And I can remember probably putting it on and showing other people and saying, "Look at those." The parallax
it looked amazing. I mean, I remember seeing it. I think it was one of those games that got demoed in Curry's or Dixon's, or it would be on the Amiga in the shop. That would be one of the ones they'd put on. It was either that or one of the demo discs. It would be, what was the more famous of the demo, sort of rave type demo-y discs that were on? I can't remember, the whole demo scene, they would either be that or Shadow of the Beast that they'd put on, because it looked amazing.
Yeah,
but that was that crossover of what you're talking about between a game having to use your imagination, and the box art was the best looking thing about it. And then the game started looking better than the box art. It is very, very different. That is very different.
Yeah. But you, so we kind of alluded that you do collect.
I do collect, yeah.
You do have
I do. I sort of don't know why. I sort of don't know why. I think it's partly because I sort of always have. I've always been surrounded by it. And as I mentioned in the podcast before, it's what I used to do for a living. So I literally have spent my life from the age of 16. Prior to that as well, when I was just playing games, but then from 16 working, selling them, I've been in a room with shelves with games on.
Yeah.
Literally my entire adult life has been with it's so funny seeing now, particularly now, YouTubers, that's become the thing that you have to do. If people could see us now, apart from you, who's in your area with a bit of artwork behind you, I would just look like any other YouTuber with shelves full of games.
It's
so funny.
No other YouTuber has those curtains.
No. I should point out the curtains I've got are the original curtains I had as a kid. I mean, that's how bad it is. You know what I mean?
Funny.
It's true.
It's funny. You've replicated your safe space, right, from the shop. Then, rather than like rejecting it, you kind of recreated this. Yeah,
it's ridiculous.
But then, yes, because you've got like a man cave. Then, kind of, you've got your own safe space where you've got all your games, your nostalgia. Whilst I've moved house and country and different type of houses many times, and I'm no longer. I don't have much, and I've still got too much junk. Like I don't know how many. Just cables.
I've got your retro stuff here.
Exactly.
I'm actually storing Chris's stuff in my house.
Do you still have all the Warhammer stuff, the role-playing games?
Yeah.
I
got all your 2000 AD stuff. I got the lot.
I got
your D20s, your D16s.
Oh, I bought some D20s, like...
What? You've got a load there here.
I know. I bought some. I don't know how long ago. That was a couple of years ago, and I don't know why. I mean, I don't play role-playing games.
Exactly. Why do we do it?
I couldn't get my son into the kids. They just think that's totally nerdy role-playing games.
Of course they do. I'm surprised you even tried. They're not interested in that.
I think it's amazing for your imagination. I just think it's amazing. Yeah, maybe that's why this article has, resonated with me. This filling in, using your imagination, filling in the gaps. And that's why they say, about being bored, right? It's difficult to be bored. When we were kids, it was easy to be bored, right? There was things that, everyone, if anyone's listening to this, they're our age, so they know exactly what we're talking about. But just in case in 100 years' time someone extracts this as some sort of historical document,
hello, future people.
Yeah, future people. Yeah, when we were kids back in the 80s, so 10 years old, 84,
1980s. Just so you're clear.
There was an hour and a half, 2 hours of kids' TV in the afternoon.
Yeah,
we had 3 or 4 channels.
3
channels, TV channels, that is. So now a kid just...
Television channels don't even exist anymore. There's no such thing.
It's difficult to be... I mean, of course you're bored, but you just fill the bored time in with anything that's going on, like social media.
Staring at your phone.
Exactly, staring at your phone. Yeah.
I'm doing it now. I leant over to turn my phone on the moment I said staring at my phone.
Well, that's right. I mean, what were we doing when we were loading a Spectrum game? So loading a Spectrum game might have taken 5 minutes. You weren't flicking, you weren't looking at your phone. Nowadays, you would load it and you'd be looking at your phone, and next thing you know, it'd be half an hour gone, and you've just been reading a load of stuff that doesn't affect you.
And it's been on the 1p, 2p screen.
Waiting. Yeah, exactly.
Waiting for you to press the button.
Yeah. To work out what the keys are.
Just hammer every button until something happens.
Yeah. So,
oh, damn, it's on Kempston joystick. Damn.
So, you know, I think, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. At the risk of sounding like an old person, the times have changed. And, I don't know. What were we saying? I've forgotten.
That sounds like a good time to end it. It's got to the point in the podcast, everybody, where we don't remember what we're talking about. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that. That was us talking instead of talking about a game for a change. Do you want us to do more of this? If so, let us know what sort of thing you want to hear us talk about. There's plenty from back in the day to talk about. That was Chris. I'm Phil. This has been Spectrum Days, the channel that ruins our childhoods by remembering that was the only time we were happy.
I mean, happiness was owning a thermal printer for the ZX Spectrum, so we could talk about thermal printers, maybe.
And for the Game Boy.
Did you have a light pen? A pen? I had a pen for the Spectrum too, as well, if I remember rightly.
Oh, good Lord! Oh, yeah. Crikey.
Well, stories for another day.
Yeah, right. Well, do like, subscribe, and all that other stuff. And if you are the people from the future, please come and get us, because we don't like it here. And please rescue us.